Let's talk about 3 items every car owner should have. Now, these 3 things I talk about today won't be too groundbreaking, but hopefully I can give you some new insight and potentially make you take some action on something you may have been delaying. And some good news too, all 3 of these items I'm going to mention in this video today will cost under $100 each. Now, these are actually in no particular order, but just to do a 3, 2, 1 countdown, we're going to start with our number 3 item, and this is an OBD2 scanner. Now, this can also be known as an engine code reader or diagnostic scan tool. There's a couple different names it goes by. But the beauty of this is, as long as your car is a 1996 model year or newer, this should work. And this tool is typically used to read and clear fault codes that are present in your engine's ECU. So if there is this fault in your ECU, it usually is accompanied by a light that comes on your dash, and that's typically a service engine soon light or a check engine light. They both kind of serve as the same thing. And of course, a CEL or an SES should be taken seriously, but I honestly think something like this can help you determine the seriousness of the issue you might have with your car. Now, these scan tools can be really easy to use. Typically, there's a plug-in when you sit in the driver's seat that's near your knees, somewhere underneath the dash, that you would plug this into. So once you plug in your scanner, you should be able to turn your car to the on position and then walk through the menu within the scanner itself, and that'll give you plenty of options, whether it be to check the codes and see what they are, clear the codes, and numerous other things these are capable of. So of course, that's just a basic overview of how these scanners work. Some of them can work a little bit differently. Consult the manual of whatever scanner you buy. So I think being able to pull these codes can be helpful in a number of ways. Of course, if you're mechanically inclined, now whatever this code is telling you, you should be able to look it up and determine more about what your actual problem is with your car, the reason why that light may have came on. And on the other hand, if you're not very mechanically inclined, but you have this tool, you could still run the code and then you could pass that along to your mechanic, especially if you're concerned, let's say, about even driving the car. If there's a light on, you could tell your mechanic, hey, this is what the light's on for, and he could say, hey, yeah, that's not that big of a deal. You should be able to drive it into the shop, as opposed to having to pay like an extra towing fee or something if it was more severe and you didn't think you should drive the car. And what I've seen in the case of some of these newer cars is they can often go into what's called like a limp mode, or just like a safety mode, where they're just trying to protect things in the car. Of course, something is wrong with your car. That's why it's doing that. But of course, no one wants to actually be stranded. And in these limp modes, sometimes your car can not even go above 5 miles per hour, or it can be very hard to move your car. So what's nice is, in case of emergency, you could utilize a scanner like this to not only check the codes, but then potentially clear the codes in case of emergency, so you could just keep moving, or you could just actually help determine the severity of potentially what's going on with your car. Again, not really recommended to do this, but it's sometimes, the better option is being able to get your car off the highway. So of course, please know, if you are clearing codes and then continuing to drive, you are doing this at your own risk, and you should really know what you're getting into. And you should also know that clearing those codes does not actually really fix anything. All you're typically kind of doing is putting a Band-Aid on a larger wound, and the only way you can probably fix that wound is having someone wrench on your car. And I found this particular scanner on Amazon for like $25. It's pretty small, pretty easy to use. So I'll put a link to that in the video description, so you can check that out if you want to. And as I mentioned, this was just high level, and this is just the basic stuff of what this can do. And typically, the more money you spend on a scanner, the more things it can actually do for you. On to the number 2 item I recommend you have for your vehicle, and that is an Apple AirTag or some non-Apple equivalent. So the price for an Apple AirTag is actually only around $25 to $30. I've owned 4 of these for over a year now. They do have little batteries in them, and the battery life is said to be over a year. And I can verify this because in the 4 I've had, even having them in cars in Wisconsin winters out in the cold, all of these have lasted me for the 14 months I've had them so far, and they're still going strong on the original batteries. But of course, know that you can get inside these and change the batteries too, so you can add a new battery to them. So why buy it? Well, I feel like it's just kind of very cheap insurance in case your car is stolen, and sometimes it's just nice to know where your vehicles are, especially if you lend it out or borrow it to someone, something like that. But you should know that these are not actually intended to be vehicle tracking devices. That being said, even though I think you have a better chance of finding your car if it's stolen, just know that these are not actually anti-theft devices. The real intent of these is just to track things that you currently own. And on a little side note, if you're a fan of watching Doug DeMuro, you may have recently seen a video of his where he bought an AirTag and sent it to someone that he had purchased a car from so he could watch it be shipped across the country to him. So that's another use case for these. If you are buying a car, you could send one of them to the previous owner of the car. They could put it in there and then you could watch it make its journey on the way to your house. So you may be asking, well, why is it actually not a good anti-theft device? Well, these Apple AirTags are designed to prevent people from tracking you and any unwanted tracking. So what that really means is if someone actually stole your car and had one of these in there, if they had an iPhone, they would get a message after driving not very long, probably 5 miles, maybe less, I don't know for sure, but they would get a message on their phone saying that someone is tracking them. And not only that, they actually get the option to disable the tracker, again, if they have an iPhone. So of course, if someone has an Android, they're not gonna have, that same instant notification. However, there are Android apps out there that could scan for Apple AirTags, so those do exist. However, I don't think, since the Android is not on like the Apple Find My network, I don't think they could actually ever fully disable this very easily unless they had an iPhone. But again, that's not its real intended use. It's not actually an anti-theft device, so that's why people would have the ability to turn this off if they stole your car. So again, these are not intended to be car tracking devices in the case of it being stolen. If you are really worried about theft, there are a lot of other anti-theft devices you could certainly look into that are meant more for actually tracking your car in the case that it was stolen. But also, so this video isn't only about Apple devices. Other than the Apple AirTag, there are things called a Tile or Samsung's version of this you could buy as well. So there are other options, and while I'm thinking of it, that might be a good redundancy. If you did want to buy an Apple AirTag and then a different brand, you could potentially have both of them in your car. And that way, if someone did steal your car and they thought they turned off the one and only tracker in your car, you could have a backup. So we're on to the number one item I recommend you have for your vehicle, and that is simply a dash cam. This, again, I feel like is just very cheap insurance. And these can be had typically for under $100 and get you some good video quality out of them. And what's nice about this is if you have this in your car, you have a very good chance of keeping yourself from getting into a situation where if you got into an accident, it wouldn't be a he said, she said thing. You would ideally have video proof of what happened. Of course, they do make these costing over $100. Those usually include Wi-Fi options, smartphone connection options, or even something like cloud storage. But when it comes to my dash cams, I like to keep it simple. Mine are basically only recording to a micro SD card or something similar. And I like that because then I feel like I have more control over the footage itself. It's not stored on anyone else's server. I have everything here. And the way it's working is it's consistently recording over how much storage is available here. And it's breaking out the clips into little 3 to 5 minute sections and consistently recording over and over again, and it's deleting the oldest files along the way. Also, all my dash cams have what's called a G sensor, and basically that's a sensor inside the camera where if it detects too much movement or too much G forces, that particular video clip will then be saved to a read-only file on the SD card. So when that file is put into the read-only folder on the SD card, it's basically there permanently until you go into it and delete it. And its main function or its main purpose really is that if you got into an accident, for example, ideally this would be smart enough because it got such, G-forces that it would save that clip to the read-only folder. And that way if you had to drive home or drive further, ideally it's automatically saving that for you, so it wouldn't just get written over if it got to be too old of a clip on the camera. However, luckily in my own personal experience, I've never actually had to go through an accident that I had recorded on a dash cam. What's typically in my read-only folder is times I hit big potholes or any other rough parts of the road. Then it kind of saves those because it felt enough G-forces, it decided to save that clip. But of course, like all things, this isn't foolproof. I mean, if you only have the camera facing towards the front of the car and something happened towards the rear, you're not going to catch that and have the proof that you might need. They do make optional cameras where it's not only front or rear, but then there's also in-car, a lot of that stuff. So you can get really fancy with this, but for the most part, I just recommend that you at least have one that faces on your dash facing out the front of the car so it gets what's coming towards you. And because it's an issue I personally experienced, I'll let you know about this potential issue that you could have as well. And that comes from when I utilized the dash cam for a while on a vehicle, I ended up taking it out and I left it unused for a couple months, which resulted in it changing the date. And it changed the date back to an older year. So it went back to like 2015. So of course you might think, well, a wrong date on a clip really isn't the end of the world, right? Well, of course, I had been using this though, and the SD card that was in it was full, and it was full of footage from like 2020. So what ends up happening is you need to remember that this tries to keep the newest video clips and delete the oldest video clips. So what was happening to me is I was driving around thinking this was consistently recording, at least a half hour of, my last drive. But all it was actually doing was recording the last 3 minutes, and then it consistently kept recording over that same 3-minute clip because all the other clips that were on the SD card were from 2020. And as soon as it finished recording the newest clip, it thought it was from 2015. So it went through and just kept basically re-recording, and I only had a little, 3-minute loop. Luckily, when I went to check for some just regular footage, I noticed the issue and realized, that was a problem, and I reset the date, and now it works fine. I do think as car technology advances, this can be a thing of the past. A lot of people already know about Tesla's Sentry mode. They have multiple camera angles on their cars, and that comes from the car from the factory. I would really like to see more new cars have some at least dash cam facing out the front as a standard option on their cars in the future. And that's it. Those are the 3 things I recommend everyone has for their car. And honestly, I feel like almost all of them could really be incorporated in new cars nowadays with all the technology that's available on new cars. Although with people not working on their cars as much anymore, I could see where a lot of people wouldn't find the scanner as useful. But hopefully with some of the things I talked about earlier, you realize that it could be useful for pretty much anyone, especially if we could just kind of go into our car's touchscreen and have it tell us the codes rather than making us buy this tool, to show us the codes and give us more insight into what's wrong with our car. So there you have it, everybody. Those are, of course, just my opinions on 3 items I think most everybody should have. But please tell me, what did I miss? What's one of your must-haves? Leave a comment in the comment section, of course, and let me know. But as always, this is Paul from Boosted Films saying thanks so much for watching. So when a file is put into that read-only file folder, date, and it defaulted to like 220. I also think it's common for a lot of newer cars to go into what's called like a limp. On to the number 2 thing I recommend you have for your vehicle, and that is an Apple RTAG.